The day I found the letter was the day my life ceased to be my own. It lay there on the polished marble floor of Windsor Castle, innocuous yet somehow ominous, its crisp white envelope a stark contrast against the dark stone. I, Philip Hartley, a royal doorman of 30 years' service, bent to retrieve it, my knees creaking in protest. As my fingers closed around the envelope, a chill ran through me, as if the paper itself carried a warning. If only I'd known then what I know now, perhaps I'd have let it lie. To Her Majesty the Queen, read the neat, handwritten address. No postmark, no stamp. How had it found its way here, to this private corridor? I turned it over in my hands, the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a lead cloak. Protocol dictated that all correspondence for Her Majesty went through proper channels, vetted and screened. Yet here was this letter, having somehow slipped past every security measure we had in place. I stood there, frozen in indecision. The sensible thing would be to hand it over to security, let them deal with it. But something, call it intuition, call it foolishness, made me hesitate. In 30 years, I'd never directly interacted with the Queen beyond the occasional curtsy and Your Majesty. To deliver this letter personally would be a breach of protocol, possibly even a risk to my position. But the unusual circumstances of its appearance gnawed at me. "Everything all right, Philip?" I started, nearly dropping the letter. Lady Amelia Blackwood, the Queen's personal secretary, stood at the end of the corridor, her sharp eyes fixed on the envelope in my hands. "Yes, my lady," I replied, straightening my posture. "I found this letter addressed to Her Majesty. It appears to have been misplaced." Lady Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of something, concern, intrigue, crossing her face before her usual mask of polite indifference slipped back into place. "I see. I'll take that. Thank you, Philip." She held out her hand, expectant, authoritative. It would have been easy, so easy to simply hand it over and forget about it, to return to my post and let the wheels of the royal household turn as they always had. But that chill I'd felt when I first touched the envelope returned, stronger now. A warning, yes, but also a challenge. "With all due respect, my lady," I heard myself say, my voice steadier than I felt, "I believe this might be a matter for Her Majesty's personal attention." Lady Blackwood's eyes narrowed, the polite mask slipping for just a moment to reveal a flash of anger. "That is not for you to decide, Mr. Hartley. The letter, if you please." I hesitated, my grip on the envelope tightening. In that moment, I made a decision that would alter the course of my life, and though I didn't know it then, the very foundation of the monarchy. "I apologize, my lady, but I must insist on delivering this to Her Majesty personally." The words hung in the air between us, a challenge, a defiance of decades of tradition and hierarchy. Lady Blackwood's face flushed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Very well," she said, her voice cold. "Follow me." As we walked through the opulent corridors of Windsor Castle, my mind raced. What had possessed me to do this? I, who had always been the model of discretion and obedience. Yet something about this letter, its mysterious appearance, the reaction it had elicited from Lady Blackwood, it all pointed to something larger, something that sent tendrils of both fear and excitement coursing through me. We arrived at the Queen's private study, a room I had passed countless times but never entered. Lady Blackwood knocked softly, then opened the door. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice now the epitome of deference, "Mr. Hartley has found a letter he believes requires your personal attention." I stepped into the room, my heart pounding. The Queen sat at her desk, reading glasses perched on her nose, a stack of documents before her. She looked up, her gaze sharp and inquiring. "Your Majesty," I said, bowing deeply. "I found this letter in the East Corridor. It's addressed to you, but it bears no postmark or stamp. I felt it necessary to bring it directly to your attention." I held out the envelope, my hand trembling slightly. The Queen regarded me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to my surprise, she smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Hartley," she said, taking the letter. "Your discretion is appreciated." As she opened the envelope, I saw Lady Blackwood shift uncomfortably out of the corner of my eye. The Queen's face remained impassive as she read, but I noticed her knuckles whiten as she gripped the paper more tightly. "This is concerning," she said finally, looking up. Her gaze fell on Lady Blackwood. "Amelia, please arrange a meeting with Sir James immediately. Mr. Hartley, thank you for bringing this to me. You've done a great service." I bowed again, relief washing over me. But as I turned to leave, the Queen spoke again. "Mr. Hartley, a moment more, if you please." Lady Blackwood left, closing the door behind her. I stood before the Queen, my palms sweating. "You've worked here for quite some time, haven't you?" she asked. 30 years this March, Your Majesty." She nodded, her eyes studying me intently. "And in all that time, you've never sought to overstep your position. Why now?" I swallowed hard, searching for the right words. I can't rightly say, Your Majesty. Something about the letter felt important, urgent even. I felt compelled to ensure it reached you directly." The Queen was silent for a long moment, her gaze never leaving my face. Then she sighed, suddenly looking older, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. "Mr. Hartley, what I'm about to tell you must not leave this room. Do you understand?" I nodded, my throat dry. "The letter you've brought me contains information about a potential threat to national security, an espionage scandal that, if true, could shake the very foundations of our government and our relationship with our allies." My mind reeled. Espionage? Threats to national security? These were the stuff of novels, not the day-to-day life of a palace doorman. "I need someone I can trust," the Queen continued. "Someone outside the usual channels. The letter suggests that the conspiracy may reach into the highest levels of government and the royal household itself." I felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath me. "Your Majesty, surely you don't mean—" "I don't know who I can trust, Mr. Hartley, but you've shown initiative and discretion today. I'm asking for your help." "Help? From me?" I was no spy, no investigator. I was just a doorman, a servant who had stumbled into something far bigger than himself. "What would you have me do, Your Majesty?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Find out who sent this letter. Trace it back to its source. You have access to areas of the palace that others don't, and you're practically invisible to most of the household. Use that to your advantage." I nodded, my mind spinning. "And if I discover something, Your Majesty?" "Report only to me," she said firmly. "Trust no one else, not even those you've known for years. These are dangerous waters we're navigating, Mr. Hartley." As I left the Queen's study, my world had shifted on its axis. The familiar corridors of Windsor Castle, once my home away from home, now seemed filled with shadows and secrets. Every face I passed, every conversation I overheard, took on new significance. Who had sent that letter? And how deep did this conspiracy run? As I returned to my post, outwardly the same Philip Hartley I'd always been. Inwardly, I was changed. I was now a man with a mission, a confidant of the Queen herself. But as the weight of my new responsibility settled upon me, a gnawing doubt began to grow. Was I truly up to this task? And more importantly, was I ready for the truths I might uncover? Only time would tell. And as I stood at my post, watching the comings and goings of the royal household with new eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was not on our side. The game was afoot, and I, Philip Hartley, reluctant spy in the House of Windsor, was now a player. God save us all. The following days passed in a blur of routine duties and covert observations. I found myself scrutinizing every face, analyzing every conversation overheard in passing. The weight of the Queen's trust pressed upon me, a constant reminder of the delicate tightrope I now walked. As I stood at my usual post near the grand staircase one crisp morning, I couldn't help but reflect on how I'd come to this point. 30 years ago, I joined the royal household as a bright-eyed young man, full of pride at serving the crown. My father, God rest his soul, had nearly burst with pride when I told him of my appointment. "You'll do us proud, lad," he'd said, his weathered hand clasping my shoulder. "Just remember, in that house, walls have ears and shadows have eyes. Keep your own counsel, and you'll go far." How prophetic those words seemed now, as I found myself at the center of a web of intrigue I scarcely understood. My reverie was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. I straightened, schooling my features into the mask of impassive servitude I'd perfected over the years. Lady Blackwood rounded the corner, deep in conversation with a man I recognized as Sir James Holloway, the Queen's private secretary. "Must be dealt with swiftly," Sir James was saying, his voice low but carrying in the quiet hallway. "If word of this gets out, the consequences could be catastrophic." Lady Blackwood nodded, her face grave. "I've already put feelers out through my usual channels. If there's a leak, we'll find it." They passed me without a glance, their voices fading as they continued down the corridor. I remained still, my mind racing. What were they discussing? Could it be related to the letter? Or was this simply the usual business of running a royal household full of small crises and potential scandals? As the day wore on, I found myself increasingly on edge. Every conversation seemed laden with hidden meanings, every glance potentially suspicious. It was exhausting, this constant state of alertness, and I began to wonder how actual spies managed it. That evening, as I made my final rounds before ending my shift, I noticed a light still on in one of the lesser-used drawing rooms. Curious, I approached quietly, years of training allowing me to move almost silently across the plush carpets. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see Lady Blackwood seated at a small writing desk, her back to me. She appeared to be writing something, her pen scratching furiously across the paper. As I watched, she finished, folded the paper, and slipped it into an envelope identical to the one I'd found addressed to the Queen. My heart began to race. Could this be connected? I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall as Lady Blackwood rose and moved towards the door. I quickly stepped back, assuming a position of casual vigilance as she emerged. "Oh, Mr. Hartley," she said, startled. "I didn't realize anyone was still about." "Just finishing my rounds, my lady," I replied, bowing slightly. "I noticed the light and wanted to ensure everything was in order." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "How diligent of you. Yes, everything is quite all right. I was just finishing up some correspondence." As she spoke, I noticed she was subtly angling her body, keeping the hand holding the envelope out of my direct line of sight. "Very good, my lady," I said, maintaining my deferential tone. "Will there be anything else?" "No, thank you." "Good night, Mr. Hartley." I watched her walk away, my mind whirling. The envelope, the secretive behavior, it all pointed to something suspicious. But was Lady Blackwood involved in the conspiracy the Queen had mentioned, or was she working to uncover it? And how could I find out without revealing my own clandestine mission? As I made my way home that night, the streets of Windsor quiet and misty, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, every passing car a possible tale. I chided myself for such paranoid thoughts, but the seed of doubt had been planted. My modest flat, once a haven of peace after long days at the castle, now felt exposed and vulnerable. I double-checked the locks, drew the curtains tight, and only then allowed myself to breathe deeply. Sitting at my small kitchen table, I pulled out a notebook and began to jot down everything I'd observed over the past few days. Lady Blackwood's conversation with Sir James, the mysterious letter she'd written, the subtle tensions I'd noticed among the staff. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. As I wrote, a memory surfaced, something I'd all but forgotten in the whirlwind of recent events. Years ago, when I'd first started at Windsor, there had been a young footman named Edward Talbot. Bright, ambitious, always seeming to be in the right place at the right time to overhear important conversations. He'd risen quickly through the ranks, eventually securing a position in the diplomatic service. I hadn't thought of Edward in years, But now, looking back, his meteoric rise seemed almost too perfect. And if I remembered correctly, he'd been particularly close to Lady Blackwood during his time at the palace. Could Edward be involved in this somehow? It was a tenuous connection at best, but it was something to go on. I made a note to see if I could track down where Edward was posted now. Perhaps a casual inquiry to some of the older staff members might yield some information without raising suspicion. As I sat there, piecing together fragments of memory and observation, I was struck by the absurdity of my situation. Here I was, a simple doorman, playing at being a spy. What did I know of international intrigue or high-level conspiracies? I was more likely to bungle this entire affair than to uncover any real plot. And yet, the Queen had entrusted me with this task. She'd seen something in me, some quality that made her believe I could help. I couldn't let her down, couldn't let my own self-doubt sabotage this mission before it had even truly begun. With renewed determination, I turned back to my notes. There had to be a pattern here, some thread I could follow. I just had to find it. The next morning, I arrived at Windsor Castle earlier than usual, hoping to observe the comings and goings of the early staff. As I passed through the servants' entrance, I nearly collided with Sarah, one of the younger maids, her arms full of freshly laundered linens. "Oh, Mr. Hartley, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, struggling to keep her balance. "No harm done, Sarah," I said, helping her steady the pile of linens. "You're about early this morning." She nodded, a flicker of something, nervousness, crossing her face. "Yes, Lady Blackwood requested these linens be changed out in the blue suite. Said we're to expect an important guest." My ears pricked up at this. An important guest? I hadn't heard anything about that. Sarah shrugged. Nor had I, until this morning. It's all very hush-hush, apparently. Lady Blackwood was most insistent that everything be perfect. I thanked Sarah and continued on my way, my mind racing. An unannounced important guest, secret preparations. It all seemed to fit with the atmosphere of conspiracy I'd been sensing. But who could this guest be? And what connection might they have to the mysterious letter? As I took up my post, I resolved to keep a close eye on the blue suite. If this guest was indeed connected to our mystery, their arrival might be the break I needed. The morning passed slowly, each tick of the grand clock in the entrance hall seeming to echo in the tense atmosphere. I observed the usual parade of staff and visitors, noting anything out of the ordinary. Lady Blackwood passed by several times, each time looking more harried than the last. It was nearing noon when I spotted a familiar face entering the castle. Sir James Holloway, looking uncharacteristically disheveled, hurried past me without so much as a nod. His face was pale, his brow furrowed with worry. As he passed, I caught a glimpse of a document clutched in his hand. A document with an official seal I didn't recognize. Before I could ponder this further, a commotion at the main entrance drew my attention. A sleek black car had pulled up, and from it emerged a distinguished-looking man in a tailored suit. He was accompanied by two men who practically screamed, "Security," their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. As the man approached, I felt a jolt of recognition. Though I'd never met him in person, I'd seen his face often enough on the news. It was the head of MI6, the very heart of British intelligence. What on earth was he doing here, unannounced and clearly trying to keep a low profile? As I watched him being ushered quickly towards the private quarters, a chill ran down my spine. Whatever was happening, whatever conspiracy was unfolding within these walls, it was bigger than I'd imagined. Much bigger. And I, Philip Hartley, erstwhile doorman and reluctant spy, was caught right in the middle of it all. The arrival of the MI6 chief sent ripples through the usually calm waters of Windsor Castle. Though I maintained my outward composure, inwardly I was a maelstrom of questions and theories. What could have prompted such a high-level clandestine visit? As the day wore on, I observed a flurry of activity centered around the blue suite. Staff members scurried back and forth, their faces taut with tension. Lady Blackwood seemed to be everywhere at once, issuing hushed orders and overseeing preparations with an intensity that bordered on mania. It was nearing the end of my shift when I spotted an opportunity. Sarah, the young maid I'd spoken to earlier, emerged from the blue suite, her arms laden with a tray of empty tea things. As she passed, I noticed her hands trembling slightly, causing the china to rattle. "Allow me to help you with that, Sarah," I said, moving to steady the tray. She jumped, nearly dropping the lot. "Oh, Mr. Hartley, you startled me!" As I helped her regain her grip on the tray, I lowered my voice. "Is everything all right? You seem a bit shaken." Sarah glanced around nervously before leaning in. It's nothing, really. Just all this fuss over the guest, but..." She hesitated, biting her lip. "But?" I prompted gently. "Well, I couldn't help overhearing some of what they were saying in there. About traitors and moles and, oh, I shouldn't be talking about this." I patted her arm reassuringly. "It's all right, Sarah. We all hear things we're not meant to in this job. Best to forget about it and carry on, eh?" She nodded gratefully, but as she turned to go, she paused. "Mr. Hartley, have you noticed anything odd lately? With Lady Blackwood, I mean?" My pulse quickened. "Odd? How so?" "It's probably nothing, but I saw her the other night in the East Wing. She was talking to someone on her mobile, very hush-hush-like. When she saw me, she looked scared. I've never seen her look scared before." I thanked Sarah for her insight, assuring her once again that she'd done nothing wrong by confiding in me. As she hurried off to the kitchens, I mulled over this new information. Lady Blackwood scared? The woman I knew was unflappable, always in control. What could have rattled her so? As I pondered this, a commotion from the direction of the Queen's private quarters caught my attention. Sir James Holloway emerged, his face ashen, followed closely by the Queen herself. I'd rarely seen Her Majesty looking so grave. "Your Majesty," Sir James was saying, his voice low but carrying in the quiet corridor, "we must act quickly. If this information is correct..." "We must be absolutely certain, James," the Queen interrupted, her tone steely. "The implications are too severe to act on mere suspicion." They passed by me, too engrossed in their conversation to notice my presence. As they rounded the corner, I heard Sir James say, "But ma'am, if there truly is a traitor within the palace walls..." Their voices faded, leaving me reeling. A traitor within the palace? Could this be connected to the letter I'd found? My mind raced, trying to connect the dots between the mysterious correspondence, Lady Blackwood's strange behavior, and now this talk of betrayal at the highest levels. Lost in thought, I almost missed the figure slipping out of a side door further down the corridor. Almost, but not quite. Years of observing the comings and goings in the palace had honed my peripheral vision to a fine edge. It was Lady Blackwood, and she was clearly trying to avoid being seen. She glanced furtively in both directions before hurrying towards the servants' stairs, clutching what looked like a file to her chest. Without conscious thought, I found myself following her, keeping a discreet distance. My heart pounded in my chest, a voice in my head screaming that this was madness. I was no spy, no trained operative. I was a doorman, for heaven's sake, but another voice, one that sounded remarkably like the Queen's, reminded me of the trust that had been placed in me. If Lady Blackwood was involved in something nefarious, I had a duty to find out what it was. I followed her down the servants' stairs and through a series of lesser-used corridors, marveling at how she seemed to know every hidden nook and cranny of the castle. Finally, she slipped into a small room off the old wine cellar, a place rarely visited these days. Creeping closer, I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. Lady Blackwood seemed to be talking to someone, her voice too low for me to make out the words. But the other voice? It was familiar somehow, though I couldn't quite place it. Suddenly I heard footsteps approaching from the other end of the corridor. Panic seized me. I couldn't be caught here, eavesdropping like some common snoop. Looking around frantically, I spotted a large tapestry hanging on the wall. Without thinking, I slipped behind it, praying that whoever was coming wouldn't notice the slight bulge in the ancient fabric. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped right in front of the door I'd been listening at. I heard a knock, then the door opening. "My lady," a male voice said, one I recognized as belonging to one of the younger footmen, Thomas. You're needed upstairs. The MI6 chief is asking for you. Thank you, Thomas, Lady Blackwood replied, her voice steady despite the furtive meeting I just witnessed. I'll be right there. I heard the door close, then the sound of retreating footsteps. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like an eternity before I dared to emerge from my hiding place. The corridor was empty. I approached the door Lady Blackwood had exited, my hand reaching for the knob before I caught myself. What was I doing? If I was caught snooping in here, I'd have no explanation that wouldn't immediately reveal my clandestine mission. Reluctantly, I turned away, my mind whirling with questions. Who had Lady Blackwood been meeting? What was in that file she'd been carrying? And how did all of this connect to the talk of traitors and moles? As I made my way back to more familiar parts of the castle, I tried to piece together what I knew. The mysterious letter, the secret meetings, the unexpected arrival of the MI6 chief, it all pointed to something big, something that threatened the very heart of the monarchy. But who was behind it all? Lady Blackwood, with her suspicious behavior and secret rendezvous. Sir James, who seemed to know more than he was letting on. Or was there someone else pulling strings from the shadows? I was so lost in thought that I almost walked straight into the Queen herself as I rounded a corner. Your Majesty, I exclaimed, bowing deeply to cover my surprise. I beg your pardon. The Queen regarded me with a piercing gaze, and for a moment, I feared she could see right through me, could read every illicit thought and suspicion running through my mind. Mr. Hartley, she said, her voice low. A word, if you please. She gestured to a nearby empty room, and I followed, my heart in my throat. As soon as the door closed behind us, the Queen's regal mask slipped, revealing a woman deeply troubled. I fear the situation is worse than we initially thought, she said without preamble. There are forces at work here that threaten not just the monarchy, but the very stability of our nation. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The Queen continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to know if you've discovered anything at all, that might shed light on this matter. I hesitated, weighing my words carefully. How much should I reveal? How much could I trust even to the Queen herself? Your Majesty, I began slowly, I've observed irregularities, behavior that seems out of character for certain individuals, meetings and conversations that don't quite add up. The Queen's eyes narrowed. Go on. Taking a deep breath, I recounted what I'd seen and heard over the past few days, careful to stick to facts rather than speculation. As I spoke, I watched the Queen's face, seeing the gravity of the situation etched in every line. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Hartley, what I'm about to tell you must not leave this room. The safety of the realm may depend on your discretion. I straightened, feeling the weight of her words settle on my shoulders. You have my word, Your Majesty. We have reason to believe, she said, her voice barely audible, that there is a plot to undermine not just the monarchy, but the very foundations of our democracy. A conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of government, the intelligence services, and... She paused, pain flashing across her face. And the royal family itself. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The royal family? Could it be that the threat came from within the Queen's own household? Your Majesty, I said, my voice hoarse. How can I help? The Queen's gaze sharpened, fixing me with an intensity that pinned me to the spot. Continue your observations, Mr. Hartley. Trust no one. And if you uncover anything at all, you come directly to me. Is that understood? I nodded, my throat too dry for words. As I left the room, my head spinning with the magnitude of what I'd just learned, one thought crystallized in my mind. I, Philip Hartley, lifelong servant of the Crown, now stood as perhaps the last line of defense against a threat to everything I held dear. The game had changed, the stakes raised to unimaginable heights. and I was terrifyingly, thrillingly in the very heart of it all. The days that followed my conversation with the Queen were a blur of heightened vigilance and mounting tension. Every interaction, every overheard snippet of conversation took on new significance. I found myself analyzing the most mundane of occurrences, searching for hidden meanings and clandestine signals. It was exhausting, this constant state of alertness. I began to understand why spies in novels always seemed so world-weary and paranoid. "Trust no one," the Queen had said. But in a world where everyone was a potential threat, how could one maintain one's sanity? My first breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was stationed near the Queen's private study when I overheard a heated exchange between Sir James and Lady Blackwood. "Can't keep this under wraps much longer," Sir James was saying, his usually composed voice tinged with frustration. "If we don't act soon, it'll be out of our hands entirely." "And what would you have us do?" Lady Blackwood retorted, her tone icy. "Accuse a member of the royal family without concrete proof? That's tantamount to treason itself." I strained to hear more, but they lowered their voices, moving further down the corridor. A member of the royal family? The Queen's words echoed in my mind. The conspiracy reached into the royal family itself, she'd said. But who? And to what end? As I mulled over this new information, a commotion at the main entrance caught my attention. A group of tourists, part of the limited tours allowed in certain areas of the castle, had become separated from their guide. One of them, a young man with a camera hanging around his neck, was peering intently at a painting in the hallway. "Sir," I said, approaching him, "I'm afraid this area is off limits to visitors. If you'd kindly rejoin your group." The man turned, and I felt a jolt of recognition. It was Edward Talbot, the former footman I'd been thinking about earlier. But he wasn't here as staff, he was posing as a tourist. Our eyes met, and I saw the moment he recognized me too. A flicker of panic crossed his face before he schooled his features into a mask of innocent confusion. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry," he said, affecting a slight American accent. "I must have taken a wrong turn. Could you point me back to the tour group?" I played along, giving him directions back to the public areas. As he hurried away, my mind raced. What was Edward doing here in disguise? And how did this tie into the larger conspiracy? I made a mental note to look into Edward's current position in the diplomatic service. If he was involved in this plot, his role could be crucial. That evening, as I was finishing my shift, I decided to take a risk. Using one of the palace computers, I logged into the staff directory, searching for any information on Edward Talbot's current posting. What I found made my blood run cold. According to the records, Edward Talbot had been working at the British Embassy in Moscow for the past 2 years. But a quick search of recent diplomatic news revealed that he'd been quietly recalled to London just 3 weeks ago, around the same time I'd found the mysterious letter. I was so engrossed in my research that I almost didn't hear the approaching footsteps. Quickly closing the browser windows, I stood up just as Lady Blackwood rounded the corner. "Mr. Hartley," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I didn't expect to find anyone here at this hour." "Just finishing up some paperwork, my lady," I lied smoothly. "I'm on my way out now." She nodded, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Very diligent of you. Good night, then." As I walked home that night, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift in my mind. Edward Talbot, with his diplomatic position and his clandestine return to Windsor. Lady Blackwood's secret meetings and nervous behavior. The MI6 chief's unannounced visit. And at the center of it all, a threat to the very heart of the monarchy. But what was the connection? What could possibly link a mid-level diplomat to a conspiracy of this magnitude? The answer came to me in the early hours of the morning, jolting me from a fitful sleep. The letter. The one that had started this whole affair. What if Edward Talbot was the sender? It made a certain kind of sense. As a former insider with current diplomatic ties, he would have access to sensitive information. And if he had uncovered evidence of a plot within the royal family, going directly to the Queen might have seemed like his only option. But then why the cloak and dagger act at the castle? Unless he feared for his safety. Unless the conspiracy was so far-reaching that he trusted no one, not even his former colleagues. The next day, I arrived at Windsor Castle with a renewed sense of purpose. I needed to find a way to contact Edward, to hear his side of the story. But how to do it without alerting the very people who might wish him harm? My opportunity came sooner than I expected. As I made my rounds that morning, I spotted Edward again, this time dressed as a groundskeeper, working on one of the less prominent gardens. He was alone, hidden from the main paths by a high hedge. Taking a deep breath, I approached him. "Lovely weather for gardening, wouldn't you say, Mr. Talbot?" He froze, then slowly turned to face me. Gone was the fake American accent, replaced by the cultured tones I remembered from his days as a footman. "Mr. Hartley, I suppose there's no point in pretending, is there?" I shook my head. "I think it's time we had a chat, don't you?" Edward glanced around nervously. "Not here. It's not safe. Meet me tonight, at the old boathouse by the river. Midnight. Come alone." Before I could respond, he picked up his tools and walked away, blending seamlessly into the busy grounds of the castle. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anticipation and dread. Was I walking into a trap? Or was I about to uncover the truth that could save the monarchy? As midnight approached, I made my way to the old boathouse. The night was clear but moonless, the path to the river barely visible in the darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, sent my heart racing. Edward was waiting for me inside the boathouse, a small electric lantern casting eerie shadows on the weathered walls. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure I could trust anyone, but I remembered you from my time here. You always seemed honorable." "I'm here now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tell me what's going on, Edward. What have you uncovered?" He took a deep breath. "It's bigger than you can imagine, Mr. Hartley. Corruption at the highest levels, a plot to undermine not just the monarchy, but democracy itself." "Who's behind it?" I asked, leaning in. Edward opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a sharp crack echoed through the night. The boathouse window shattered, and Edward stumbled backwards, a dark stain spreading across his chest. "Run!" he gasped, pressing something into my hand. "Trust no one! The evidence! All here!" And then he collapsed, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. I stood frozen for a moment, shock and horror paralyzing me. Then survival instinct kicked in. I pocketed whatever Edward had given me and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. As I fled through the darkness, the sound of pursuing footsteps spurred me on. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, finally collapsing in a secluded copse of trees far from the boathouse. Only then, gasping for breath, did I examine what Edward had pressed into my hand. It was a small USB drive, innocuous looking but undoubtedly containing information people were willing to kill for. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I sat there, the weight of the tiny drive feeling like a boulder in my pocket. Edward was dead. I was now the sole keeper of whatever secrets he'd uncovered. And somewhere out there, a killer was likely searching for me. The game had changed once again. No longer was I just an observer, a gatherer of whispered secrets. Now I was actively in danger, holding information that could topple empires. As I slowly made my way back towards Windsor, my mind raced. Who could I trust with this information? The Queen? Sir James? Or was I now truly alone, the last line of defense against a conspiracy I barely understood? One thing was clear, there was no going back. I, Philip Hartley, one-time doorman and reluctant spy, was now in deeper than I'd ever imagined possible. And the next steps I took could determine not just my fate, but the fate of the nation itself. The morning after Edward's murder dawned gray and oppressive, mirroring the turmoil in my mind. I had barely slept, the events of the previous night replaying in an endless, horrifying loop. The crack of the gunshot, Edward's final gasping words, the weight of the USB drive in my pocket. It all felt like a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. But this was no dream, and I couldn't afford the luxury of shock or grief. Not when every moment could bring discovery, every friendly face could mask a deadly enemy. I arrived at Windsor Castle that morning, as if it were any other day, forcing myself to go through the motions of my usual routine. But inside, I was a maelstrom of fear, suspicion, and grim determination. The USB drive felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket, its secrets a ticking time bomb. As I took up my post, I couldn't help but see the castle in a new light. The grand halls and opulent rooms, once a source of pride and wonder, now seemed full of shadows and hidden dangers. Every corner could conceal an assassin. Every whispered conversation could be plotting my demise. It was mid-morning when Lady Blackwood approached me, her face a mask of concern. "Mr. Hartley, are you quite all right? You look rather pale." I forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as strained as it felt. "Just a bit under the weather, my lady. Nothing to worry about." She studied me for a moment, her gaze uncomfortably penetrating. "I see. Well, do take care of yourself. These are trying times for all of us." As she walked away, I couldn't help but wonder, was her concern genuine, or was she probing for weaknesses? Was she involved in Edward's death? The uncertainty was maddening. I knew I needed to view the contents of the USB drive, but doing so on any castle computer was out of the question. The risk of electronic surveillance was too great. I would have to wait until I was off duty, find a secure location. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. I observed the comings and goings of the castle with hypervigilance, noting every unusual interaction, every furtive glance. Sir James seemed particularly agitated, engaged in numerous hushed phone conversations in secluded corners. As my shift neared its end, I overheard a snippet of conversation between two junior staffers that made my blood run cold. "Body found by the river this morning. Some poor groundskeeper, they're saying." "Bloody hell. Accident, was it?" That's the official line, yeah. But I heard one of the guards saying it looked like murder. I hurried away before they could notice me, my mind racing. They had discovered Edward's body. How long before they connected it to me? How long before they realized what he had passed on? As soon as my shift ended, I left the castle, resisting the urge to run. I knew I was potentially under observation, so I had to appear as normal as possible. I made my way to a small internet cafe in Windsor, one I knew had private booths and computers not directly connected to their network. Settling into a booth at the back, I plugged in the USB drive with trembling hands. What I found made my breath catch in my throat. The drive contained a trove of classified documents, diplomatic cables, and personal correspondence. As I sifted through the files, a picture began to emerge, one more horrifying than I could have imagined. The conspiracy wasn't just about undermining the monarchy or British democracy. It was a plot that spanned continents, involving high-ranking officials from multiple countries. At its heart was a plan to manipulate global finance and politics, using the British royal family as unwitting pawns. And the mastermind behind it all? The name that kept appearing, the linchpin of the entire operation, was none other than Lord Reginald Hastings, the Queen's own cousin and trusted advisor. The evidence was damning. Secret offshore accounts, coded messages, even transcripts of clandestine meetings. Lord Hastings had spent years building a network of corrupt officials, financial institutions, and even criminal organizations. His ultimate goal appeared to be nothing less than reshaping the global order, with himself and his co-conspirators at the top. But what chilled me to the bone was the realization that the conspiracy had already begun to unravel. Edward's murder was just the latest in a string of convenient accidents and suicides that had befallen those who got too close to the truth. As I stared at the screen, the magnitude of what I had uncovered threatening to overwhelm me, a new message popped up. It was an email sent to an encrypted address, time-stamped just hours before Edward's death. "The package has been compromised. Initiate Protocol Omega. Leave no loose ends." My blood ran cold. Protocol Omega. Whatever it was, it had cost Edward his life. And now, unknowingly, I had stepped into his shoes. I quickly copied the most crucial files onto a new, clean USB drive I had purchased on my way to the cafe. Then, taking a deep breath, I securely erased the original drive and pocketed the new one. It wasn't a moment too soon. As I exited the booth, I spotted two men entering the cafe. Their suits screamed, "Government agent," and their eyes scanned the room with predatory focus. I kept my head down, mimicking the exhausted slouch of the other patrons as I made my way to the exit. Once outside, I walked briskly, fighting the urge to break into a run. My mind raced, trying to process everything I had learned and decide on my next move. I couldn't go to the police. The conspiracy reached too high, and I had no way of knowing who was compromised. The same went for MI5 or MI6. And approaching the Queen directly seemed impossible now. I was likely being watched. As I turned a corner, a sleek black car pulled up beside me. The rear window rolled down, revealing the last face I expected to see, Lady Blackwood. "Get in, Mr. Hartley," she said, her voice brooking no argument. "Quickly now." For a moment, I hesitated. Was this a rescue, or was I walking into a trap? But then I saw the look in her eyes, a mixture of fear and determination that mirrored my own inner turmoil. I got into the car. As we sped through the streets of Windsor, Lady Blackwood turned to me, her usual composure cracking slightly. "I assume, Mr. Hartley, that you now know far more than any doorman should." I nodded, my hand unconsciously moving to the pocket containing the USB drive. "I could say the same about you, my lady. Whose side are you on?" She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "The side of the crown, Mr. Hartley. Always the crown. Though I fear that puts us in a very small minority at the moment." As she spoke, I noticed her hands, steady, but with a smear of ink on the right index finger. The same ink I had noticed on the mysterious letter that had started this whole affair. "It was you," I breathed. "You sent the letter to the Queen." Lady Blackwood's eyes widened slightly, then she nodded. "Very observant. Yes, it was me. I've suspected something was amiss for months, but I never dreamed it went this deep." "Lord Hastings," I said, watching her reaction carefully. She flinched, then nodded grimly. "So you know." "Yes, Lord Hastings is at the center of it all. I've been trying to gather evidence to find a way to expose him without bringing down the entire monarchy in the process." "And Edward? Did you know about him?" Pain flashed across her face. "I recruited him, used our old connection to bring him in when I realized I was out of my depth. And now he's dead because of it." The car turned down a narrow lane, then came to a stop in front of a nondescript townhouse. Lady Blackwood turned to me, her gaze intense. "Mr. Hartley, I won't lie to you. We're in grave danger. But we're also in a position to stop this conspiracy before it's too late. I have a safe house and contacts who can help us, but I need to know, are you with me?" I looked at her, this woman who had been a part of my daily life for years, yet who I now realized I barely knew. Could I trust her? Did I have a choice? In that moment, I thought of everything I had witnessed, everything I had learned. I thought of Edward, dying in that boathouse, entrusting me with his life's work. I thought of the Queen, her face lined with worry as she spoke of threats to the very foundation of our nation. I made my decision. "I'm with you," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Let's finish this." As we exited the car and hurried into the safe house, I knew that the next few hours would determine not just our fates, but the fate of the nation we had sworn to serve. The endgame had begun, and I, Philip Hartley, was ready to see it through to its bitter end. The safe house was a stark contrast to the opulence of Windsor Castle, a small, sparsely furnished flat with heavy curtains drawn across the windows. As Lady Blackwood secured the door behind us, I felt the weight of our situation settle upon my shoulders like a leaden cloak. "Right," Lady Blackwood said, her crisp tone belying the tension in her eyes. "We don't have much time. They'll realize soon enough that you've slipped their net, and it won't take them long to trace you to me." I nodded, pulling out the USB drive. I've got everything Edward uncovered. It's worse than we imagined, isn't it? I fear so, she replied, taking the drive and inserting it into a laptop that looked far more sophisticated than its battered exterior suggested. Let's see what we're dealing with. As Lady Blackwood sifted through the files, her face grew increasingly grim. I watched her carefully, still not entirely certain I could trust her, but knowing I had little choice. This is it, she murmured, more to herself than to me. The smoking gun we've been looking for. Financial records, communication logs, even recorded conversations. Lord Hastings has been meticulous in his treachery. But why? I asked, the question that had been burning in my mind finally spilling out. Why would he betray everything? He's the Queen's cousin, for heaven's sake. Lady Blackwood's laugh was hollow. Power, Mr. Hartley. Pure, unadulterated power. Hastings has always resented his position. Close to the crown, but never on it. This conspiracy, this reshaping of the global order, as he calls it, is his bid for the power he's always craved. She turned the laptop so I could see the screen. Look here. He's been siphoning funds from royal accounts for years, using them to bribe officials, fund extremist political groups, even destabilize entire economies. All to create a world where democracy is weakened, where strongmen and oligarchs hold sway. A world he thinks he can control from the shadows. As I absorbed this, a thought struck me. The Queen, does she know? About Lord Hastings, I mean? Lady Blackwood's expression softened slightly. She suspects. That's why she entrusted you with looking into matters. But she can't know the full extent of it. If she did, she didn't need to finish the sentence. If the Queen knew the depths of her own cousin's betrayal, it would break her heart. So what do we do now? I asked, feeling wildly out of my depth. We can't exactly walk into Scotland Yard with this. No, Lady Blackwood agreed. Our best bet is to get this information directly to the Queen and a select few we know we can trust. Sir James, for one. He may be a bit of an old duffer, but he's loyal to the bone. Just then, a notification pinged on the laptop. Lady Blackwood's eyes widened as she read the message. It's from one of my contacts in MI5, she said, her voice tight. They've issued an all-points bulletin for your arrest, Mr. Hartley. You're being framed for Edward's murder. My heart sank. Of course they would try to silence me this way. So that's it then, I said, resignation creeping into my voice. It's over. Not yet, it isn't, Lady Blackwood snapped, a fire in her eyes I'd never seen before. We have the evidence, we just need to get it to the right people before Hastings and his cronies can stop us. She began typing furiously, her fingers flying over the keyboard. I'm sending encrypted copies of everything to secure drops. Even if they catch us, the information will get out. As she worked, I paced the small room, my mind racing. There had to be something more I could do, some way to tip the scales in our favor. And then it hit me. The letter, I said, causing Lady Blackwood to look up sharply. The one you sent to the Queen that started all this. You must have kept a copy, right? Insurance? A slow smile spread across her face. Mr. Hartley, you continue to surprise me. Yes, I kept a copy. It's in a safe deposit box at... She trailed off, her eyes widening in realization. At a bank not half a mile from here. If we could get that letter, combine it with what we have here, we'd have a complete paper trail, I finished. From the first suspicions to the hard evidence. Enough to convince even the most skeptical observer. Lady Blackwood nodded, already shutting down the laptop and securing the USB drive. It's risky. They'll be watching the banks, expecting us to make a move like this. But they'll be looking for you, I pointed out. Not for a simple doorman running an errand. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Very well, but we do this carefully. I'll create a diversion, draw their attention. You get to the bank, retrieve the letter, and meet me at the castle's east gate in 2 hours. Can you do that? I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. I can. I will. What followed was the most harrowing 2 hours of my life. I won't recount every heart-stopping moment. The close call with a patrol car, the tense minutes in the bank as I accessed the safe deposit box, the gut-wrenching sprint through back alleys when I thought I'd been spotted. Suffice it to say, when I finally reached the east gate of Windsor Castle, the letter securely hidden inside my jacket, I felt as though I'd aged a decade. Lady Blackwood was there, disguised as a tourist, her eyes lighting up with relief when she saw me. "Well done, Mr. Hartley," she murmured as we fell into step together, just another pair of sightseers admiring the castle. Now comes the hard part. Using her intimate knowledge of the castle's layout and schedules, we managed to slip inside undetected. As we hurried through lesser-used corridors, Lady Blackwood filled me in on her part of the plan. "I've arranged for the Queen to be alone in her study. Sir James will be with her. With any luck, we can present our evidence before Hastings realizes what's happening." But luck, it seemed, was not on our side. As we rounded the final corner to the Queen's study, we came face to face with Lord Hastings himself, flanked by two men who could only be his personal security. For a moment, we all froze, the tableau almost comical in its unexpectedness. Then Hastings' face contorted with rage. "Seize them!" he barked, but Lady Blackwood was faster. With a move that would have made James Bond proud, she flung open a hidden panel in the wall, a servant's passage I'd never known existed, and shoved me through it. "Go!" she shouted, already turning to face our attackers. "Get to the Queen!" I hesitated for a split second, torn between helping her and completing our mission. But I knew what had to be done. I ran. The passage was narrow and dark, but mercifully short. I burst out into the Queen's study, gasping for breath, to find Her Majesty and Sir James staring at me in shock. "Your Majesty!" I panted, dropping to one knee and holding out the USB drive and letter. "Forgive the intrusion, but you must see this. The fate of the kingdom depends on it." What followed was a whirlwind of activity. Royal protection officers securing the room, Sir James poring over the evidence with a face growing stonier by the minute, the Queen listening with an expression of deepening sorrow as I recounted everything Lady Blackwood and I had uncovered. And then, just as I finished my tale, the door burst open. Lord Hastings strode in, his usually immaculate appearance in disarray, a wild look in his eyes. "Your Majesty," he began, but froze when he saw the documents spread across the desk, the damning evidence of his treachery laid bare. The Queen rose, fixing her cousin with a gaze that could have frozen fire. "Reginald," she said, her voice soft but filled with a steely resolve that made even Hastings take a step back. "I think it's time we had a talk." As royal guards entered to take Lord Hastings into custody, I sagged with relief. It was over. We had done it. In the days that followed, the true scope of the conspiracy was revealed, sending shockwaves through the corridors of power. Lord Hastings and his co-conspirators were arrested, a carefully managed press release informing the public of a foiled plot against the crown. Lady Blackwood, I was relieved to learn, had escaped with only minor injuries. She received a commendation for her bravery, as did I, though mine was given quietly, away from the public eye. "Mr. Hartley," the Queen said to me during a private audience, her eyes twinkling with a warmth I'd never seen before. "It seems we owe you a great debt. Perhaps we should consider a change in your position. Royal Doorman and Defender of the Realm has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" I couldn't help but smile. "Thank you, Your Majesty, but I believe I've had quite enough excitement. If it's all the same to you, I think I'll stick to opening doors." And so I did. Life at Windsor Castle slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such earth-shattering events. But now, as I stand at my post, I do so with a newfound appreciation for the weight of the history around me, and the knowledge that sometimes, the most unlikely of people can change the course of that history. I am Philip Hartley, Royal Doorman and Reluctant Hero, and this is my story.